In our eighth and final exhaustive look at water, we're going to look at the legal protections for water. So mostly we're going to focus on the Clean Water Act, how successful this was, how it helped to fund infrastructure, permitting systems, how, yes, we've made real progress, but it's incomplete progress. Believe it or not, water pollution control has been among the most broadly popular and effective of all the environmental legislation that we've passed here in the United States. The reason for this is because surface water pollution is often both highly visible and one of the most common threats to environmental quality. This is, however, not without controversy. Most laws and rules have faced objections because they seek to restrict individual actions that threaten the public interest. So one example of this would be unregulated waste disposal. So this is going to save money. If you are able to just dump any waste that you have without having to go through proper waste treatment, that's going to save the person who produces the waste a lot of time and a lot of money. But the public is going to bear the burden of increased health costs and impaired water resources that are associated with that, just dumping waste wherever you want and however much you want of that. So opponents of federal regulation have tried repeatedly to weaken or eliminate the Clean Water Act. Their objections are to the cost. So how much it's going to cost the person who's producing the waste. And they're also arguing that that is putting environmental interests ahead of economic interests. But despite all this, water protections have been widely supported. And in the next slide, we're going to go through some of the most important water legislation in the United States throughout the history of the Clean Water Act. A fairly comprehensive list of important water quality legislation, and you'll notice that a lot of this came out of the 70s, where we started to kind of realize, oh my gosh, we need to regulate the pollution, the contaminants that are entering our waterway. The Federal Pollution Control Act came out in 1972, and that established a uniform nationwide control for each category of major polluting industries. We also had the Marine Protection, Research and Sanctuaries Act, which is going to regulate ocean dumping, very important. The Safe Drinking Water Act of '74 is probably one that's gotten the most press recently. This requires minimum safety standards for every community water supply. So it's there to protect the community. They regulate a lot of different types of contaminants, but most important, I think, to us are going to be bacteria, which, remember, have a high risk. If you have, it's a high risk to humans if you have pathogenic bacteria. It's a high health risk. One that we've seen in the news recently has been lead. So this also regulates the amount of lead that you can have in your community water supply. And we see violations of this when we talk about, say, Flint, Michigan. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA, regulates storage, shipping, processing, and disposal of hazardous waste. So this is going to prevent industry or anybody really from being able to dump hazardous waste just anywhere. It's going to regulate how they do that, how they send that waste off. Skipping down, the Clean Water Act is an amendment to a 1972 Water Pollution Act. This sets the national goal for the U.S. and in their wording, they would like to create fishable and swimmable quality for all surface waters in the U.S. We're not there yet, but this is the goal, is to have fishable and swimmable water. And those are about the most important ones, or the ones that you're going to see most when talking about water contamination. Passage of the Clean Water Act in 1972 was a bold, and your book describes it as a bipartisan step that made clean water a national priority. Congress came together on something and decided we want clean water and we are going to pass tough regulations for this. It's one of the most significant and effective pieces of environmental legislation that's ever been passed by the U.S. Congress. It's also really immense, and it's a complex law. It has over 500 sections regulating everything from, say, urban runoff to industrial discharges to municipal sewage treatment to land use practices to wetland drainage. So it's really a comprehensive piece of legislation. It also established a National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES, which requires an easily revoked permit for any industry or a municipality or other entity dumping waste in surface waters. So For a point source, the Act is going to require discharge permits and that the person who is doing the discharges is using a BPT or best practicable control technology. If you're using toxic substances, this Act is going to set national goals of best available and economically achievable technologies, or BATs. These regulations have had one of the most positive effects on water quality. So they've worked together to really improve the quality of our surface water. Permits are also important as well because it requires disclosure of what's being dumped. Previously, people would be able to dump things. We wouldn't know what's getting dumped. So of course, you'd have to test the soil, test the water, and find out by surprise this is there. But it also gives regulators very valuable data, as well as evidence should they need to take somebody to court for discharging into a waterway. It's going to provide evidence for litigation for those purposes. Surface water is not yet swimmable or fishable all over the United States. However, it has significantly improved since passage of the Clean Water Act. As we've said before, there's been so many areas of progress and improvement since passing Clean Water Act. Do we have fishable and swimmable waters in every part of the U.S.? At this point, we do not, but we're seeing a lot of progress. As a consequence of the Clean Water Act, only about 10% of our water pollution now comes from industrial and municipal point sources. As we've talked about before, the best way to handle water pollution is to prevent pollutants from getting into the water. So prevention is one of the key components of the Clean Water Act, and it's another one of those reasons that we started a permitting process through NEPDES. So we're issuing those permits for industry, municipalities, other entities, anyone who's going to be discharging waste in surface waters. Giving someone a permit to discharge feels like we're giving them permission to pollute, but it serves a bigger purpose. What we're doing is we're recognizing that, yes, surface waters can dilute some level of pollutants. We know that it can handle some contamination and that nature can handle removing some of those contaminants from the water. Such as nutrient discharge from a small town wastewater treatment plant. But what the permit does more, that is more important, is it's going to ensure some degree of disclosure and monitoring of what's entering our waterways, and that's most important. Do keep in mind that if there are too many violations on a permit, the regulators can impose a fine to that particular entity or even sue the polluter. So it gives us a little bit more regulation, a little bit more of an open book as to what's going into our water supply. One of the biggest improvements has been in sewage treatment. Nearly everyone in urban areas is now served by a municipal sewage system. No major city is going to discharge raw sewage into a river or a lake. There is an exception. This does happen as overflow during heavy rainstorms. So again, this is not perfect, but what an improvement we've made since 1972.